Hello, guys. Welcome to the second volume of my historical fiction bedtime stories with a little spooky vibe to them. As I mentioned in the intro to Volume 1, these stories are tales I spun for my children while waiting for many of my juries to deliberate. No need to rehash the opening of Volume 1. I just wanted to say thank you to all those who have listened and to the law offices of Sam Adam Jr. for sponsoring this channel. I've added a 30-second commercial after the first 3 new episodes and at the end of Volume 2 to show our true appreciation for their support. Many of you who have enjoyed Volume 1 have said that they'd like me to make these a little longer so that they can enjoy going to bed while listening, but there just weren't enough of them to last long enough. To help remedy that issue, I've placed all episodes I've made thus far into Volume 2, with 3 brand new tales at the very beginning. If you enjoy these stories, please like and subscribe to my channel as new creepy fables are provided every week. Again, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. History is the facts of the past being told in the present. We always look back to gauge how we will forge ahead in the future. The promises of yesterday can turn into the fortunes of tomorrow. And that's the history of this great nation. Hope, trust, and hard work invested in community to pay dividends years down the line. Well, at least that's what we'd like to believe. Newington, Connecticut, just outside of its capital city of Hartford, was alive with optimism and excited anticipation at the beginning of the 20th century. For more than 275 years at the time, Newington had been a beacon of light to British immigrants and European victims of religious persecution looking to start anew. Its favored motto, growth and progress, has been imprinted on the town seal since 1798 and has quite literally lived up to its guarantee. Growing at a massive rate during the second half of the 1800s, Newington saw the development of a railway system passing through, a population explosion that more than tripled the number of inhabitants, and the implementation of a trolley transportation schedule giving free rides to the large number of senior citizens that found its calm atmosphere a great place to retire. By 1900, the town had become a small suburb for Hartford and was generally considered one of the best places in America to live out the twilight of life. That is, if you were allowed to live. Born in 1873, Amy Dugan Archer was a strange child who would eventually become one of America's first female serial killers. The 8th of 10 children, she always preferred to spend time by herself and forego playing with the other kids in the neighborhood. Extremely quiet, she would often be seen walking with local stray dogs that would later be found dead and mutilated. People who knew her family said she could come and go through a room and no one ever knows she was there. It was disconcerting to her mother, who decided to educate her at the New Britain Normal School in Connecticut instead of homeschooling her like many of the other children. Finally, absenting herself from her family, Amy Dugan, at the age of 24, met and married James Archer and moved to Newington to open and operate a nursing home for seniors. She and James would care for them until they died in their care, which was usually considered natural until James's death in 1910. His demise led to suspicions that something in that nursing home wasn't quite right. Between 1907 and 1911, there were only 12 total deaths in the home. But after James passed, the number of dead rose to 60 between 1912 to 1915. A Authorities began investigating and realized that all of the deaths during that time seemed to only occur after Amy had received large sums of money from those that had died. Exhuming 5 victims from their graves, the medical examiners determined that all 5 had been killed by arsenic poisoning. Subpoenaing records from the local drugstore in town, it was determined that Amy had been purchasing massive quantities of rat poison since 1907. Arrested and charged, Amy Archer was found guilty and sentenced to death until she was later found mentally insane and her life spared. So horrid an episode in American history that a Broadway play named Arsenic and Old Lace was written, dramatizing the terrible murders. Yet the theater wasn't the only place that the evil seems to have been recreated. Town folks have all claimed that the Dugan Archer house on Main Street still continues to harbor history of those murders. Former residents insist that strange occurrences press on throughout the property every day. Faucets turning on by themselves and doors opening and shutting without cause. The residents have declared hearing sobbing coming from a closet in the middle of the night, and knives stuck in kitchen cabinet doors while they'd been sleeping. One story details that in 1972, the new homeowner, living alone, loved his morning coffee and went into the kitchen to make his cup and go to work. Tasting the beverage, he spit it out immediately, as it was extremely bitter. Checking his sugar bowl, he found it to contain a mixture of sweetener and arsenic. One final tale regarding the old Archer home claims that police officers in 1996 were called anonymously and informed that the basement flooring hid a number of crimes from the late 1930s. Securing a warrant to search, authorities dug up the flooring and found a large hole with animal skeletons buried within. Upon making the discovery, the police captain in charge of the investigation went up the stairs to call in forensics. But the door on the landing shut by itself and locked. Trying to open it, the captain slipped and fell down the entire flight, breaking his neck and dying on the spot. We have all had occasion to make mistakes in what we do. No one is perfect is a familiar refrain heard throughout this vast country of ours. Yet sometimes a cultural mistake is made on a national level that simply becomes fact instead of fiction. Crazy to think, but one of America's natural treasures is really a common mistake. The buffalo. Everyone in the U.S. believes that majestic, powerful, and furry quadruped is a national animal. But the fact is, there's no such thing. America has no buffalo. Only the American bison, which in 2016 became our symbol for a national mammal. For hundreds of years, we've all been wrong. Yet whether our nomenclature for this wonderful animal is right or not, no one can deny its importance to our national culture, history, and economy for well over 300 years. The continent's largest land animal, American bison have roamed the Midwestern prairie lands for millions of years, grazing the grasslands and providing numerous tribes of Native Americans a source of food, clothing, and even shelter. Homesteaders making their way west in the early 1800s, hunted and ate them to persist throughout cold, harsh winters. Even entire towns had been developed in the American West, dependent upon the great migration of the beasts, so that whole communities could continue our manifest destiny toward the Pacific Ocean. But humanity always seems to push the limits of excess and devastation. Settlers moving across the nation inevitably led to the destruction of indigenous peoples. The American bison was one such casualty of that expansion. Being so important to the subsistence of the natives, the United States government, in conjunction with private entities, began mass killings of bison to prevent the tribes on the plains from surviving. Millions of them were slaughtered, reducing the food chain and eventually pushing the tribes out of the area in search of food. By the late 1870s, there were stockpiles of animal bones 50 feet high, strewn all across Montana, South Dakota, and Nebraska. So heavy was the killing, death and rotting flesh seemed to be everywhere, all at once. Folk tales, told to this day, claim that the souls of the resplendent creatures can be seen standing upon open fields of grass and then suddenly disappearing upon approach. Another story tells of a young native boy hiding in the tall grass, watching a settler with a Winchester rifle sitting atop a horse just picking off the bison as they ran away in fear. Running back to his tribe, he informed his chief of the episode, who in turn sent 3 scouts out to the area to search for the man shooting the animals. As they arrived, they ran into an ambush and were gunned down by a number of townsfolk waiting in the weeds. Legend has it that on dark and cold winter nights, ghosts of the 3 riders can be seen climbing the ridge near the tiny town called Buffalo, Montana, right on the site of the state's first national bank. In early 1932, a sighting of the 3 was claimed by one of the bank's clerks getting into work early that morning to prepare for the day. Telling his boss about the riders, he was shot dead later in the morning during a failed bank robbery conducted during the heat of the Depression. 2 months later, the bank went under, and so did the town. Finally, a Nebraska tale spooks of a man that was found killed on his farm in the late 1980s. He was located by his wife and son as he lay in a field beaten and bloodied. The doctors who examined his body claimed that he was so badly injured, it appeared he had been stomped on by a herd of elephant. The police went to the scene to determine what happened, and all that could be found were the fresh bison hoof marks in the grass around where the farmer had been killed. Sending a search party and a helicopter out to find the wild bison, the police realized the entire property had been enclosed by a locked fence and no bison within 150 miles of his farm. In researching the property after her husband's death, his wife found out that their farm had been the site of Nebraska's greatest slaughter of bison by Buffalo Bill in 1872. As the 1800s drew to a close, the entire United States was in expectant upheaval. The 1893 economic depression, one of the worst in American history, had come to a close by 1900. Dreamers flocked across country to California to find fortune and fame in a growing city called Los Angeles. Oilmen and steel magnates found extreme wealth in New York, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh as cattlemen drove their herds to northern-bound trains headed from Texas and Oklahoma to the metropolises of St. Louis and Kansas City. It was a working man's country, with fortunes to be found in every nook and cranny. But gold was to be located by enterprising women as well. While commonly considered a man's place during the late 19th century, most people do not realize how important women were in the workforce. Between 1880 and 1910, the number of working women increased nearly fourfold, growing from 2.6 million female employees to 7.8 million by World War I. Women of all nationalities and races were making their impact financially. Madam C.J. Walker, with her beauty supplies and hair products, was the first black woman millionaire in the history of the United States. Olive Ann Beach in aeronautics, Coco Chanel in fashion, and Ma Perkins on the radio all got their starts in the early part of the 20th century. Times they were a-changin', and women were taking advantage of it at a quick rate. Yet not all progress is positive. While the suffrage movement and women's entrepreneurial endeavors made wonderful strides during this time, old world professions always rear their nasty head. In Chicago, the Everly Sisters brought prostitution and violence into the future. Having grown up in rural Kentucky and learning their trade in Omaha, Nebraska, the sisters strode into the Midwest and brought luxury, class, and education to their dirty trade. Opening a bordello in 1900, their House of Fun was a multi-floored building decorated in gold and silver furnishings with the latest fashions, the most beautiful women, and a clientele to match. It was their philosophy to provide the best of the best, so that the wealthiest in Chicago would come to their Everly Club and spend thousands. And it actually worked. Over the next several years, mayors, politicians, high-powered gangsters, and even the most prominent of businessmen frequented their establishment, renting rooms for the evening, eating and drinking the most expensive of culinary delights, and faking love for hours at a time. Money flowed like champagne, and the secrets cultivated quickly. The elite knew the Everlys, and the Everlys kept their confidences, even when the good times turned violent. November 23rd of 1905 was one such violent day. Preparing for another storied evening, the sisters were counting cash in the parlor before the usual money crowd arrived. They were expecting one of the richest men in the country to stop by and visit for a while. Marshall Field Jr., son of the department store tycoon who first introduced store catalogs to the world, was a regular customer of the Everly Club. Wealthy, educated, and most importantly, connected, Junior had a specific lady of the evening in mind upon his arrival. Only problem was, rumor has it, he was a sadistic trick, and this particular lady wasn't going for his abuse. Renting an entire suite for the night, Junior disrobed and began slapping the woman about the room. As he is said to have beaten her furiously, a pistol dropped from his pants. Picking it up, the woman pulled the trigger, shooting him. Mortally wounded, the Everlys arranged for him to be taken incognito from their establishment back to his home on Prairie Avenue in Chicago. By the time the police arrived, he was unconscious, and his family informed them that he had shot himself while cleaning his gun. The newspapers and other print media who were hounding the story were none the wiser. Marshall Field Jr. died 4 days later. Now, many people who have frequented the old address of the Everly Club claim to see a man on many a cold night walking down the street in a pair of pants with suspenders over his shoulders and a blood stain showing on his chest. As they approach to offer help, the man vanishes into thin air. Others have sworn that as they walk by the old field mansion on Prairie Avenue and peer through the windows on cold November nights, they've seen a man laying on an early 20th century couch, wearing suit pants and a pair of suspenders over his shoulders, bleeding from his chest. But as they draw closer to the window, the room is suddenly empty, as the home has been abandoned for years. One final ghostly escapade claims that cashiers who were working for his father at the massive department store on State Street often saw Marshall Field Jr. years after his death, walking through the men's section just before closing, getting onto the elevator on the 3rd floor and heading toward the basement. Upon the doors opening, the elevator would be empty.
My dad is, well, a great father, and he is a great lawyer.
There's nothing more important to me than my family. When I look at a person who comes in and I see that they have children, they have a family, I gotta fight for them like I'd fight for my own. Because I know there's a child right now that may not end up with a father. And who's gonna make sure they're protected? And these are the people I wanna help. These are the people I'm here for. We wanna make sure that this system works for you the way that it does for everybody else.
My dad is a great dad, and he makes good pies.
Commerce, the exchange of goods and services, is what makes the world go round, especially the large-scale transactions. Building commerce for an entire city at the birth of the 20th century was a daunting task in and of itself. Seattle, Washington, a new and vibrant little town at the turn of the century, was up for the challenge. First settled in 1851 by profiteers looking to score big from the region's abundant forests, dozens of lumber mills developed along with hundreds of shops and bars catering to the industry workers. Nestled between the deep salt waters of Puget Sound and Lake Washington, Seattle grew quickly as large ships docked in Elliott Bay, bringing cargo to and fro. Growing at a solid rate during the 1870s organically, it was the addition of the Transcontinental Railway in 1883 that saw a population explosion. By 1900, there were more than 80,000 residents, but by 1910, the city had blown to over 230,000. It was a city on the rise and in need of a great, centrally located market to handle all of that commerce. Frank Goodwin saw this as a good opportunity and made the most of it. Having made his money during the Klondike Gold Rush of the 1890s, Goodwin purchased land on a hill above the bay and created a market famously called Pike's Place. Providing a road for customers and a warehouse from which to conduct business, his arcade opened its doors on November 17th, 1907. It was an instant success. For more than 40 years, Pike's Place grew and billions of dollars in transactions took place year in and year out. Until World War II and the development of the suburbs. People had moved out of the cities, and chains of supermarkets and small stores moved with them. By 1959, Pike's Place was all but demolished, and with it, the local industry. Businessmen of all types had lost their fortunes, and many didn't take it so well. Thomas Barksdale was one such person. Having been a tailor by trade for 50 years, with his father having opened his shop at Pike's Place in 1922, Thomas had taken over the family business when his father died. Going over his books in late 1960, he panicked as his accountant informed him he was bankrupt. His wife and 5 children had no idea of the situation. Well, had no idea until the police arrived at their house on December 4th and told them that Thomas had put a pistol into his mouth and shot himself at the shop. Some say that if you walk through Pike's Place at night, when it's all quiet and the trucks have all gone and the city has stopped, if you go by Barksdale's old shop, you can see a finely dressed man walking into one of the buildings, and as you draw closer, you can hear the snap of a gunshot. Now, as lonely as ghosts seem to be in most forms, the haunts of Pike Place don't seem to be alone. Barksdale is joined by a number of spooks frequenting the old school market. One such apparition is the Gaunt Lady Jeweler, who has been seen on dark and windy nights. According to numerous eyewitnesses, a tall and thin woman has been seen walking up the street late in the evening, only to turn the corner and disappear. The locals believe that she was a jeweler at Pike's Place during the late 1940s, who would show customers sparkling diamonds and emeralds, and while distracted, she would dip her hands into their pockets and relieve them of their cash. For years she plied her trade until one afternoon she was caught by John Roberts, a gangster from New York, who quickly took out his pistol and shot her in the head, taking his money out of her dying hands. It's reported that the last person who saw the Gaunt Lady Jeweler claims that he followed her ghost one night to the corner and watched her vanish before his eyes. Going back to one of the shops to purchase a soda, he reached inside his pocket to get his money, and all of his cash had disappeared too. The ability to say no is one of the most important characteristics people of power can have. Bad investments, evil friends, and corrupt con men can all be avoided with that simple 2-letter exclamation, no. But while some have that strength of conviction, others would rather die than to disappoint. Our 29th President of the United States seems to have been incapable of such principle. Born and raised in Ohio right after the Civil War, Warren G. Harding was as affable a human being as the country had known during the 19th century, and people just seemed to love him. Simple, tall, and handsome, he was a country boy at heart and remained a local Ohioan until politics took him to Washington, D.C. Entering the Ohio State Senate in 1900, he surrounded himself with all kinds of friends. Well, not so much friends as hanger-ons. Partying and socializing was his best attributes. He used his contacts over the years to run for and win entrance into the United States Senate in 1910, and then ran for president in 1920. He and very quiet Calvin Coolidge ran on a single ticket and won by a landslide. But what people didn't understand until much later was that Harding and Coolidge weren't on the ticket alone. Behind Harding was a slew of corrupt lobbyists, politicians, and political opportunists, to whom Harding could never say no. So bad were their activities that his associates became known as the Ohio Gang. So many scandals evolved that some of his appointees to political positions had to flee to Europe to avoid being arrested, and others were eventually prosecuted and served jail time. Even his personal life was filled with strife, having engaged in numerous extramarital affairs, even with the wife of his best friend, who in turn tried to extort him for money. A rough and tumble existence, Harding would die in office in 1923. Some believe he was murdered. On August 2nd, Harding found himself in a San Francisco hotel, writhing in pain. Having had many stomach ailments over the years, 2 doctors had been placed on a 24-hour-a-day watch for their political patient. Yet calling out for help in the early morning, neither doctor could be found, and the only nurse on call had been hired 2 days before and was unfamiliar with his medications. Dying in the hotel room of a heart attack, many believe his death was caused by the numerous scandals that had recently come to light in the news. But others feel his death was the result of murder. Coming to light in the worldwide headlines was a scandal we now call Teapot Dome, where kickbacks, bribes, and collusion saw to it that oil-rich property in Wyoming went to friends of the president for cash payments. Articles written at the time suggest that the criminals behind the scandals had been slowly killing the president through poison, starvation, and pills. Nothing ever came of the accusations, but what was clear was that his wife, Florence, having spent years in embarrassment from the well-documented affairs and scandalous press, refused to allow any doctors to examine the president after death, and immediately called in the funeral director to have his body embalmed 1 hour after his death. To this day, no one is exactly sure how the president died or whether anyone killed him. But in 1930, a tell-all book was written claiming that his wife had poisoned him and hid it by refusing an autopsy. According to guests that have stayed in the Harding room at the Palace Hotel, they've been awakened in the middle of the night by a man bending over in the corner, holding his midsection. He's always dressed in a tweed suit and moans in pain. As the guests sit up to try to speak to the man, he stands up and moves toward the bathroom. Turning his head to look at them, he suddenly vanishes, as a low coughing can be heard coming from the bathroom. Not content with spooking the overnight guests in the bedrooms, Harding's ghost has also been seen haunting the hotel's restaurant on the 3rd floor. Staff members have sworn that late at night an apparition in the form of a man has been seen wandering aimlessly through the kitchen after everything has been closed for the night. One evening, after the restaurant was cleared and the waitstaff gone home, the house chef was alone in the pantry, prepping for the next morning's breakfast when he saw a man float past him and into the stand-up freezer. Grabbing the large butcher knife sitting on the carving table for protection, he followed the spirit into the freezer, only to have it shut and lock behind him. Beating on the door for help, he looked out of the small window at the kitchen and saw a note sitting next to the sink. As the night manager came in and opened the freezer door after hearing the beating, the chef rushed over to the piece of paper and snatched it up. Noticing that it was very brittle and very old, and appeared to have the hotel logo used only during the 1920s, the The handwritten message sent chills up the chef's spine. It read, "Murder." Every section of the country has its ideas of summer fun. Californians trek out to the Sierra Nevadas for hiking and camping. New Englanders fish the local tributaries and chase lighthouses as they snack on lobster ice cream and red velvet cupcakes. And Southerners clamor to outdoor venues featuring fantastic musicians and sporting events of all kinds. But it's the hot days that turn into warm, sultry nights that define the best of Midwestern summers. Families spending time bicycling along flowered cover paths or sipping wines at the local vineyards, it's widely considered the apex of summer fun for the children who love nothing better than cooling off in the fresh waters of Lake Michigan. The world's fourth largest lake by surface area, Lake Michigan is more than 300 miles long and 110 miles wide. In essence, a freshwater ocean, it has provided settlers of all kinds with food, function, and fun. Native Americans traveled the liquid trade routes for hundreds of years, catching fish and trading beaver skins with other tribes. European explorers used the lake as a means of securing their roots in the vicinity, making the lands of Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin a place where millions now call home. Up through the St. Lawrence Seaway, farmers for more than 150 years have been able to sell their produce to people from every country on the globe. More than 160 million tons of iron ore, coal, and other dry bulk goods travel through the lake and out to the world every year. Yet such an ancient and prosperous waterway doesn't come without its issues. Rogue waves, tumultuous weather patterns, and giant storms are a necessary part of life on Lake Michigan. Freaky occurrences have found their home there as well. While everyone knows of the Bermuda and Alaska triangles, less known is Lake Michigan's. For hundreds of years, ships, planes, people have all gone missing as they entered the three-sided area between Manitowoc, Wisconsin on the west, Ludington, Michigan on the east, and Benton Harbor, Michigan on the south. To this day, no one knows how many people have died in the lake, but tales of death and destruction persist. One such legend insists that in 1892, a three-masted cargo ship called the Alabaster had just unloaded raw lumber in Chicago and was returning to the port of Cleveland with a hull filled with coal and corn. All of the documentation for the invoices were properly filed, and a list of crew was provided to the harbor master prior to sailing. Yet 5 days after the Alabaster was supposed to dock in Lake Huron, a search party was sent to look for the missing ship. Finding nothing near Cleveland, they continued to search through the Straits of Mackinac and into the Lake Michigan Triangle. Seeing three sails on the horizon, the midshipman's spotter sitting in the crow's nest yelled down to the captain and pointed to the Alabaster sailing listlessly on the calm waters. Pulling next to the ship, a search party of 8 boarded the vessel. Looking for the crew, the sailors searched every part of the boat. No one was found. No blood, no bodies, no one. Figuring the ship had been taken by pirates, the captain ordered the crew to check the cargo to see if it had been stolen. Everything was still on board. Taking stock of the storage, only one thing was located that appeared strange. A small, handwritten note sitting atop a barrel of corn, which read, "God help me, God help us all. No one was ever found." Unfortunately, the Alabaster is not alone in its disappearing crew. Just as daunting is the 1937 disappearance of Captain George Donner on the O.M. McFarland. Skippering the large steamer through the ice-laden upper Michigan waters, Captain Donner ordered his crew to be on watch as he needed to nap before guiding the ship into Port Washington, Wisconsin. Leaving his second-in-command in charge, he retired to his stateroom and locked the door from the inside. When arriving at port, a cabin boy was sent to wake the captain up. Knocking on his door, no answer came. Believing something had happened to the captain, he kicked in the door to render assistance. His mouth fell open as he entered the room, for it was completely empty. The captain was gone forever. Now, while it's true that sailing through the Lake Michigan Triangle has been extremely dangerous and spooky over the years, nothing has been more frightening than the well-documented disappearance of Northwest Orient Flight of 1950. Extremely well-documented, this was the first commercial flight going from New York City to Seattle to simply vanish without a trace. A DC-4 propeller airplane, the flight consisted of 55 passengers and 3 crew members, all flying directly into the triangle. The pilot radioed everything was fine as he crossed over Benton Harbor Township and into the triangle. But that was the last transmission ever sent from the flight. It was never heard from again. Federal authorities searched for the plane all through the lake. Even sonar and numerous diving teams were employed trying to find wreckage. Nothing and no one was ever found. Every state is proud of their universities. All across the country, school spirit flowers every Saturday in the fall as football teams take to the field and students flock to the games. Over a century has passed since the beginning of the college rivalries that spurred traditions and make for heightened experiences. The University of Wisconsin has a great history of football pride combined with a stellar reputation for higher learning. Built on the shores of the 2 lakes, Monona and Mendota, in the wonderful city of Madison, UW is widely considered one of the best universities in the Midwest. Yet football and academics are far from the only highly regarded attributes of the school. Its theater program has a rich history of producing great plays, wonderful musicians, and a world-class orchestra. Union Theater, sitting at the bottom of their famous Bascom Hill, is a masterpiece of neoclassical architecture and expert workmanship. Auditorially exceptional, it is considered Wisconsin's premier forum for experiencing the theaters. Yet such a great and storied past doesn't come without its, well, hauntings. Erected in the late 1890s, many strange occurrences have been reported by professors and students alike. According to one legend, a young freshman in the theater club, not having been behind the stage before, found herself in the dark and windowless costume room alone. Grabbing a dress the director had been looking for, she tried to return and open the door from where she came and found it had locked by itself. Banging on the door, no one was around to hear her. Panicking, she kicked the door, trying to make enough sound for someone to come help. No one did. Setting the dress down on the floor next to her so she could bang with all her strength, she pounded on the door with both hands. Suddenly, the doorknob turned and the door opened. Standing in the hallway was the director, demanding she give him the dress. Bending down to pick it up, she realized it was no longer there. Turning around, the dress was rehanging on the rack. Now, ghost playing tricks on unsuspecting freshmen is one thing. A spirit spooking an entire audience is quite another. In 1950, UW was presenting an award-winning Philharmonic in the Union Theater for 3 shows over a long weekend. Tickets were sold out for the performance within 2 days of the production. On the first night, the theater was packed. Standing room only was all that was available as the musicians took the stage. In the orchestra was a single flutist who was featured in 2 of the pieces played during the program. In the middle of the second piece, the flute player had a massive heart attack and died on stage in his chair, sitting upright. No one on stage realized he had died, and no one in the audience knew either, until intermission, when he slumped over and fell onto the ground. Canceling the rest of the performance, the conductor informed the audience of what happened, but asked everyone to stay for one last piece, the flutist's favorite. The entire orchestra played the song absent the flute. So moved by the experience, many of those in attendance requested a recording of the piece. The conductor assented and went into the studio to make several recordings. Upon replaying the salute of their fallen comrade, a flute could be heard playing on stage during the performance. Sarasota, Florida. A beautiful small town of about 50,000 residents sitting right on the Gulf of Mexico, about 50 miles south of Tampa Bay. Its first mayor, Hamilton Gillespie, saw the potential in the sleepy hamlet and gave the town its motto, "May Sarasota prosper." Oh, and prosper it has. Wealth and privilege abound in this growing metropolis by the bay. Rolls-Royce, Lamborghini, Mercedes are names frequently seen parked along the main strip of downtown bars and restaurants. The best of the best is the lone standard applied to everything. Mega yachts and mansions line the small island defining the city's affluence. St. Armand's Circle, with its posh boutiques and trendy eateries, welcome the rich and powerful during the cold winters up north. Sarasota brings in the class. The sunshine keeps them there. Yet not all things are always as they seem. Glorious days can lead to scary nights, where the living cross paths with the, well, not so alive. The high-flying 1920s brought with it death and destruction in the form of the old Ritz-Carlton on Longboat Key. You see, John Ringling, of the famous Ringling Brothers, lived in a Romanesque-style villa in Sarasota and brought his entire circus to his campus in the heart of this formidable property. Hundreds of carnies, circus folks, and
Animals practiced their trade right next to the ocean waters. Yet John Ringwing saw more in Sarasota than just a quiet town for his lifestyle. He had big dreams, a resort town where people from New York, Jersey, could come and live in a lavish style. So he decided to make his dream a reality and began to build a massive Ritz-Carlton hotel on the south end of Longboat Key. 200 rooms, yacht docking facilities, and a train stop in the lobby hotel for travelers who wanted to come directly into luxury. Nothing was left out of the plans. Every luxury there for them to enjoy. But like many projects around the country in the late 1920s, money began to run short. Circuses were not in demand, and though $650,000 had already been spent, and one of the 3 wings of the hotel had been fully constructed, all activity stopped on November 26, 1926. The building was abandoned. Windows left paneless, porticos left doorless, wonderfully decorated hallways left deteriorating from the Florida heat. It was a massive castle of decay to the locals, except for the children. Children always find a way to get into an attractive nuisance, and the kiddies of Sarasota loved the dying Ritz. Children of all ages climbed through the project, teetering on windowsills, playing on the 5th and 6th floors, looking out into the Gulf of Mexico from open doorways that dropped 70 feet to the ground. It was an accident just waiting to happen. At least 8 people had fallen from the heights and were killed horrifically on the beach-laden property. Legends spoke of one high school student who was showing off for his girlfriend by walking on the roof and slipped and fell, breaking his neck on the rocks below. Travelers passing by at night claim they have seen the ghost of a young man dressed in a school uniform walking through the area. Another apparition of a young lady has been witnessed by passengers cruising by on boats late at night, her long gown blowing in the wind as she walks on the beach, only to disappear as they drew nearer. Authorities have erected a fence around the property to keep people out so they don't get hurt. But people living on the island think it was really built to keep the walking dead from leaving.
Small-town America was its most magnificent in the first decade of the 20th century. The country was now stretched from one coast to the other by a transcontinental railroad. The economy was burgeoning as the end of the Civil War brought with it an industrial revolution like none before, and Midwest corn entered onto the world stage, feeding the entire Western Hemisphere. By the beginning of 1912, villages, hamlets, settlements all across Illinois, Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas grew strong upon the backbone of mass agricultural production. Family farms and rural communities raised an entire generation on innocent ideals and unsophisticated concepts. Love thy neighbor was a familiar refrain as children skipped off to school, front doors remained unlocked, and local fairs were had every Saturday night in the town square. Oh, what a time to be alive. Well, at least for most. Some, however, found such simple living not really living at all. Evil pursuits were more to their taste. Stephen Moffat was one of those people. He made good bad and bad worse. Raising a family or keeping an honest job wasn't his cup of tea. Less mundane activities were more his style. Robbing the occasional bank or kidnapping for ransom, Stevens loved the wilder side of small-town life. The tiny police forces that came with them was all the better. Federal law enforcement was non-existent at the turn of the century, with many local towns provided with a single sheriff. Stevens Moffett used that to his advantage, and running from state to state to skip out on jurisdiction was his forte. At least, until he graduated from financial crimes to cold-blooded murder, and how quickly he attained a PhD in death. Sally Ward was the daughter of a wealthy banker in western Iowa. The local papers across the state announced her engagement and wedding to Patrick Reed, a young executive in Mr. Ward's Sioux City branch. June 17, 1912 was listed as the wedding date in the newspaper folded under Stephen Moffett's arm. Knowing that the reception for the wedding would be filled with cash gifts from all of the rich friends of the bride's family, Stevens figured it would be easy. Walk in, rob the party, and get out to Nebraska before the authorities could catch him. That was the idea, at least. But we wouldn't be telling this tale if it had been that easy. The reception hall was massive. Marble and gold were abound everywhere. An orchestra played classical music from the stage. Dozens of servants provided the guests with their every conceivable desire. 300 people dressed in the finest of tuxedos and the most expensive of gowns as they danced and drank well into the night. But fine dining wasn't what Stevens had been there for. Pretending to be a footman for one of the businessmen in attendance, he watched from the foyer. Hours passed, and he watched until finally the clock struck midnight and the guests began to come together. A line of wealthy businessmen formed to congratulate the bride and groom, handing them fat envelopes stuffed with cash, who in turn placed them in a white satin sack. Overflowing from the generosity, a servant took the bag to an anteroom and held it there for the happy couple behind a locked door. Stevens immediately went into action. Walking over to the door, he kicked it in to surprise the waiter and grab the bag. But what Stevens didn't know was that Mr. Ward had a surprise of his own. He had hired 5 Pinkerton detectives to provide security at the party and watch over the cash. When Stevens broke into the room to grab the money, he was met by the large force of men. Taking out his 2 pistols, he shot and killed every man in the room and wounded 3 more on his way out the door. $75,000 in cash was stolen in total, nearly $2 million in today's dollars. Running out of the front door, Stevens broke into a huge smile and laughed hideously as he realized he had made it, which technically was true. He had made it to his Model T Ford parked on the south end of the driveway, but that's as far as he made it. See, perched on the roof of the convention hall was Gary T. Buford, a sharpshooter from the 7th Regiment of the United States Army. He had become a Pinkerton rifleman after serving his government. Aiming for the back of Stevens' head, he fired a single shot. And as the bag of bills emptied onto the ground at the rear of his car, Stevens' smile disappeared into death's grin. For his heart had stopped beating, but for his body even hit the ground.
A lot of people think, oh, you only do celebrity clients or high-profile clients, which is not true. I want to be here for the little guy. I want to be here for those who can't fight for themselves. I want to make sure that we take on the government or we take on the insurance companies, and we do it together. People truly don't think they have a chance, that who's going to fight with them? Well, that's what I want to change. Then when they come to the law offices of Sam Adam, we can rise up and fight together. Whether you're connected or not, this system's supposed to work for all of us.
December 25th is one of the happiest times of the year. Celebrations, parties, gift giving, and praying for good cheer can be found on most everyone's front door. Snow-covered streets find people walking with a little more pep. Smells of cinnamon, sugar, and spice filter through the brightened doors of holiday-decorated shops and eateries. Cheer and good tidings show large in the smiles greeting pedestrians of all kinds. Yet as with all things, there's an exception to every rule. St. Martha's Catholic Church and School take the meaning of holiday spirit literally. For on that day, that Christmas Day, spirits of all kinds can be found haunting the American cathedral. The church itself is a grand old stone and brick building erected in 1867, right after the Civil War. Pastor Josiah Jackson commissioned its construction and raised more than $40,000 to build it. And he had grand plans for the layout, with one particular demand for the planners. It had to have a bell tower with a marble circular staircase. He insisted that the stairs be paid for by himself, which he happily did. In 1870, the church was completed, and the bell tower was the highest man-made point for hundreds of miles. Every morning at dawn, Pastor Jackson and his wife could be seen stepping onto the tower platform and ringing in the beginning of a new day. That was until December 25th, 1874. Christmas morning. On that day, Minister Fanning, the underpastor, had awoken late. He hadn't heard the morning bell that usually woke him up. Not knowing what was happening, he lit a candle and searched the church for either pastor or his wife. And finding neither, he figured he better climb the stairs and ring the bells for the town. As he got to the base of the steps, he saw reddish drops of liquid going up. His heart began beating faster as the drops of blood grew in number. Reaching the midpoint of the stairs, he found pools of blood dripping from one step to the next. Coming around the last part of the circular staircase, right before the platform of the tower, he saw it. Pastor Jackson was hanging from the bell tower rope by his neck. His face was twisted in an awful grimace. He was hanged to death. Reaching over to bring him in, Minister Fanning looked down into the bell hollow and saw her. Pastor Wife's head had been cut off and was lying 75 feet below next to her battered body. Now, no one ever knew what happened. An investigation led nowhere. no one was ever brought to justice. Yet that was not the last time Pastor or his wife had been seen in that tower. Locals say that every morning on Christmas Day, right at dawn, a headless woman can be seen through the church's windows, carrying a candle. And if you look really closely, you can see her walking around her husband's steps, up onto the platform, and throw herself off into the bell. And if you're in the right spot, standing just at the base of the tower, on December 25th, you can see a rope wrapped around the neck of a man dressed in black, hanging from the bell. Love. How glorious a thing it is to be in love. Unless, of course, it isn't. For Jonathan Rugby, love was eternal, fulfilling, and devastating. And he would search for his long-lost paramour, Claudia, forever. Rugby, an American by birth, made his fortune in London at the turn of the 20th century. A grand and international city by 1900, it had developed into a dichotomy of culture. Only two sides of the same coin persisted. One rich, one poor, no middle. For the poor and destitute, London was a grimy, crime-laden metropolis of unsafe factories, growing prostitution, and unsanitary conditions. Infantile death was a major problem, as 1 in 5 children died in their first and only year of life. Extreme poverty proliferated as people flocked to the city looking for work and housing. By 1910, more than 1 million people lived in rat-infested slums and overcrowded ghettos. But the city catered to the ultra-wealthy as well. The robber barons of the Gilded Age. Magnificent mansions, decadent carriages, and opulent architecture lined the wide boulevards as industrial magnates and corpulent bankers strode to and fro. Rugby had found a home amongst the fat cats. A structural engineer by trade, he developed and patented a method for building archways beneath the ground. For a city of millions that needed transportation, his inventions became essential and netted him millions. Between 1905 and 1910, London constructed 3 major subway lines. The Underground Electric Railways Company of London bought Rugby's patents and provided him a life of riches. Owning a large apartment overlooking Mayfair Park in London's most wealthy neighborhood, Rugby lived well. Luxury by day, theater by night. By the age of 32, he was content, being considered one of Great Britain's most eligible. That was until 1913, when he saw La Maritana at the Royal Opera House and the young Spanish vocal star, Claudio Manolo. The thunderbolt struck, and Rugby could think of no one else. The two of them talked well into the night after the production, and within hours of their meeting, he proposed marriage. His heart filled with a passion he had never known. She saw in him the object of everything she had desired. Love was glorious until it wasn't. Hearing of the proposal, Claudia's father rushed from Madrid to London to stop the wedding. Reaching her hotel room, her father confronted her about the engagement. Claudia was just 15 years old, and he forbade her from marrying a 32-year-old man she barely knew. Devastated, Claudia screamed at her father, telling him that he would forever regret denying her love, and threw herself over the balcony and into the street 6 stories below. Coming to see his love and whisper away to Paris for their wedding, Rugby was walking on the street next to her hotel as he saw her body strike the ground 10 feet away. His heart ached as he watched the light in her eyes forever fade into blackness. He would never love again.
So many people have been kind to me, even though I've represented people that they hate, people that they can't stand. They'll come up to me and tell me they appreciate what I do. I don't care if you're the mayor of Chicago or if you're a janitor, we're gonna have somebody fighting for you. When I look at a person who comes in and I see that they have children, I gotta fight for them like I'd fight for my own. Those who can't speak for themselves, those who every day of their lives they're told, you're not good enough. I wanna get those people to understand I'm here for them. Your family is my family, and that's what I really stand for.